It was late, past midnight, the kind of hour when the world is quiet, and the only sound you hear is the faint hum of your own thoughts. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of another sleepless night pressing down on my chest. Next to me, Laura was fast asleep, her breathing soft and steady. I reached over for my phone, hoping to distract myself, when something caught my eye, a notification blinking on her screen. It was a missed call from Zack. I stared at the name for a moment, my mind trying to make sense of it. Zack was my best friend, someone I trusted with my life. We'd been through everything together, college parties, breakups, job changes, even standing as each other's best man. But this, a call at this hour, to my wife? That didn't sit right. I picked up her phone, my hands shaking, but there was no message, no explanation, just that missed call, hanging in the air like a silent accusation. I put the phone back, careful not to wake Laura. My mind raced, 1,000 scenarios playing out in my head, each one worse than the last. I told myself I was being paranoid, that there had to be a logical explanation. But a gut feeling gnawed at me, refusing to be ignored. Something wasn't right. The next day I couldn't shake the unease. Laura was acting like her usual self, bright, cheerful, making breakfast as if nothing had changed. I watched her, every smile and laugh feeling rehearsed, fake. Maybe it was just me projecting my own doubts, but there was something about the way she avoided my eyes that morning that confirmed my worst fears. That's when I decided to do it. I told myself it was crazy, that I was going too far, but I couldn't let it go. I installed a hidden camera in the living room, right behind the picture frame of us on our wedding day. It was subtle and unnoticeable, and I felt a strange mix of guilt and relief as I set it up. If I was wrong, I'd take it down and never speak of it again. But if I was right, for days I watched the footage obsessively, feeling like a trespasser in my own life. At first there was nothing, just Laura going about her day, working, talking on the phone, doing all the normal things she always did. But then, one afternoon, it happened. I was at work when I pulled up the live feed. Laura was on the couch, and Zack was there too, sitting uncomfortably close. My heart pounded as I watched them talk, their laughter too familiar, too intimate, and then without warning Zack leaned in and kissed her. It was quick, but there was no mistaking it, the way she didn't pull away, the way she let it linger just a second too long. My world shattered at that moment. Everything I thought I knew, every memory, every promise, it all felt like a lie. But instead of confronting them, instead of letting the rage boil over, I just sat there, staring at the screen, feeling an eerie calm settled over me. I knew exactly what I had to do. Revenge wasn't going to be quick, and it wasn't going to be easy, but it was going to be perfect. I spent the next few days trapped inside my own mind, every interaction with Laura feeling like a cruel game of pretend. She'd smile at me, cook dinner, ask about my day, all the little things that once felt like love now tasted bitter. And Zack, he was as clueless as ever, texting me about the game next weekend, and talking about his latest work project as if he wasn't tearing my life apart behind my back. But I couldn't afford to crack. Not yet. I had to bide my time and wait for the perfect moment to set my plan in motion. So I did what I did best. I acted. I put on my best smile, laughed at Zack's jokes, kissed Laura goodnight. I became the perfect husband, the perfect friend, the perfect liar. One evening, while we were having dinner, I casually brought up the idea of a weekend trip. You know, I said, twirling my fork in the spaghetti Laura had made, it's been a while since we did something fun. Just the three of us. How about a little getaway to the lake? We could use the break. Laura's eyes lit up. That sounds amazing, Tom. We haven't done that in ages. Zack, what do you think? Zack grinned, and I could see the excitement flicker in his eyes. I'm in. It's been a while since we've hit the lake. Some fresh air would be perfect. I nodded, hiding the contempt simmering beneath the surface. Great, let's make it happen. As the week went on, I meticulously planned every detail. I reserved a cabin near the lake, rented a small boat, and made sure everything was set up just right. Laura and Zack had no idea they were walking into a carefully laid trap, and that thought alone kept me going. I was playing the long game, and every step brought me closer to the moment I'd been waiting for. On the day of the trip, we packed the car with everything we'd need, snacks, fishing gear, and enough booze to keep Zack and Laura in high spirits. The drive was filled with easy conversation, just like old times, but every laugh felt hollow, every word a lie. Laura kept glancing back at me, her smile genuine, but all I saw was the betrayal hidden behind it. When we finally arrived, the lake was just as I remembered it, serene, surrounded by thick trees and eerily quiet. The cabin was cozy, with a view that stretched out over the water. Zack and Laura were thrilled, rushing inside to claim their rooms and unload the gear. I watched them with a detached sense of satisfaction, knowing that soon their little world was going to come crashing down. The first night passed uneventfully. We grilled burgers, drank beer, and sat around the fire, reminiscing about old times. I could see Zack sneaking glances at Laura, and she'd return them with the kind of smile I once thought was reserved only for me. I pretended not to notice, playing the part of the oblivious husband, letting them dig their own graves. The next morning the weather was perfect. The sun was shining, the lake was calm, and it was exactly what I needed. I suggested we take the boat out for a spin, and Zack was all in. Laura hesitated, but I reassured her it would be fun, and eventually she agreed. We rowed out to the middle of the lake, the water glistening in the sunlight. I watched as Laura and Zack laughed together, their voices carrying over the still water. It was almost peaceful, and for a moment I wondered if I could really go through with it. But then I remembered the footage, the lies, the betrayal, and the doubt vanished. I had made sure the boat was unstable, just enough to cause a problem once we were far enough from shore. As we drifted, I pretended to adjust the engine, messing with it until it sputtered and died. The boat jerked, tipping dangerously to one side, and water began to seep in. Zack's face turned from carefree to concerned in an instant. "Tom, what's going on?" I shrugged, feigning confusion. "I don't know. The engine's acting up. We might be taking on some water." Laura's eyes widened, panic setting in as the boat continued to sink. She clung to Zack, her fear palpable. They both looked to me for answers, but I just stared at them, letting the silence stretch. "We're going to have to swim back," I said finally, my voice calm, almost indifferent. "It's not that far." Laura and Zack hesitated, realizing they had no choice. As they splashed into the cold water, struggling to keep afloat, I stayed behind for a moment, watching them flounder. It was the first time I'd seen real fear in their eyes, and it was the closest thing to justice I could deliver. I followed them back to shore, keeping just far enough behind to let them feel the full weight of their own helplessness. By the time we reached land, they were exhausted, drenched, and visibly shaken. I didn't say anything, just walked past them, leaving them to deal with the reality of their situation. That was just the beginning. They thought they'd almost drowned by accident, but it was only the first taste of what was coming. And the best part? They still had no idea that I knew everything. We drove back to the cabin in silence. Laura and Zack were still soaked, their clothes clinging to them, hair dripping with lake water. Zack tried to make a joke about our misadventure, but his voice lacked its usual bravado. Laura stared out the window, her hands trembling slightly, and I could see the fear in her eyes. It was the first crack in their facade, and I relished it. Back at the cabin, Laura went straight to the bathroom, slamming the door behind her. I heard the shower turn on, the sound of water masking whatever emotions she was trying to hide. Zack stayed in the living room, pacing nervously, his damp shoes leaving wet marks on the wooden floor. He kept glancing at me like he was searching for some kind of reassurance, but I offered him nothing. I busied myself in the kitchen, pretending to look for towels. I could feel Zack's eyes on me, the tension in the room thickening with every passing second. "Man, that was crazy," Zack finally said, trying to force a laugh. "We got pretty lucky out there." I turned to him, keeping my expression neutral. "Yeah, real lucky. Could have been worse." He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. There was something in my tone that made him uneasy, and he was starting to sense it. Good, I thought. Let him feel the discomfort, let him wonder. Laura emerged from the bathroom a few minutes later, wrapped in a towel, her face pale and drawn. She looked at me, then at Zack, and I could see the unspoken fear in her eyes. She was worried about what had happened on the lake, but more than that, she was worried about what was happening between us. "I need some air," Laura said quietly, grabbing her jacket and slipping out the back door before either of us could respond. Zack watched her go, then turned back to me, trying to gauge my mood. "Tom, listen, about what happened." I cut him off, my voice sharper than I intended. "Don't, it's fine." He blinked, caught off guard by my sudden coldness. "I just wanted to say if I could have done anything different." "Drop it, Zack," I said, not even looking at him. "What's done is done." He stared at me, searching for any hint of the friend he thought he knew, but I was already elsewhere, my mind racing with the next steps. I could see the guilt flickering in his eyes, the seeds of doubt starting to take root. I wanted him to stew in it, to feel every ounce of unease that was building between us. Later that evening, Laura was still outside, sitting by the edge of the lake, lost in her thoughts. I watched her from the kitchen window, her silhouette barely visible in the fading light. Zack sat in the living room pretending to read, but I knew he was just as rattled as Laura. The silence was heavy and suffocating, and I could almost hear the unspoken questions running through his mind. I decided it was time to push things a little further. I walked over to the window, making sure Zack could see me, and opened it just enough to let in the cool night air. "Hey Laura," I called out, my voice casual. Why don't you come back inside? It's getting late. Laura turned her head slightly but didn't move. Zack looked up, sensing the tension, and I could see him hesitating, unsure whether to go out and join her or stay put. He chose the latter, sinking deeper into his seat, pretending to be engrossed in his book. I leaned against the counter watching them both. Zack was trying too hard to act normal, flipping pages every few seconds without actually reading, while Laura remained frozen by the water's edge, staring out into the darkness. They were both trapped, stuck in their own heads, and that was exactly where I wanted them. After a while, Laura finally came back inside. She looked exhausted, like she'd been fighting a battle only she could see. She avoided my eyes, brushing past me with a murmured, "I'm going to bed." I watched her retreat down the hallway, feeling a mix of satisfaction and something else, something I couldn't quite place. I waited until I heard the bedroom door close before turning to Zack. "You okay, man? You've been quiet." He forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, just, thinking about today. That was a close call." I nodded, letting the silence stretch between us. "Yeah, makes you think, doesn't it? How quickly things can change." Zack shifted uncomfortably, and I could see the gears turning in his head. He was searching for the right words, but nothing seemed to fit. Finally, he just nodded, his face etched with a mix of guilt and confusion. I left him there, sitting alone in the dimly lit room, and headed to the bedroom. Laura was already in bed, curled up on her side, facing away from me. I slipped under the covers, the distance between us feeling wider than ever. I could hear her breathing, shallow and uneven, and I knew she was still awake. I stared at the ceiling, my mind replaying every moment, every look, every lie. This was just the beginning, and they were both unraveling, piece by piece. The best part? They still had no idea that the real storm was yet to come. The morning after the boat incident was tense. Laura and Zack barely spoke to each other, and I watched them with quiet satisfaction as they danced around the obvious. Their carefree attitude had evaporated, replaced by a shared silence that weighed on them both. I pretended not to notice, acting like everything was fine, even though I could feel the tension brewing under the surface. Over breakfast, Laura picked at her food, her eyes darting between Zack and me. Zack kept his head down, shoveling scrambled eggs into his mouth without tasting them. I sipped my coffee, enjoying the discomfort. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the point where their guilt would start eating them alive. "So," I said, breaking the silence, "what's the plan for today? More lake adventures?" I couldn't help but let a smirk slip through. Laura shot me a nervous glance, her fork clattering against her plate. "I don't think so," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe we could just stay in?" "Yeah, staying in sounds good," Zack added quickly, eager to avoid another trip to the water. I shrugged, pretending to be disappointed. "Sure, whatever you guys want. It's your trip, too." I could feel their eyes on me, searching for any sign that I was upset, but I kept my expression neutral. They were trapped in their own guilt, and I was going to let them stew in it. Later, while Laura was busy tidying up the cabin, Zack pulled me aside. He looked uneasy, his usual confidence replaced by a nervous energy. "Tom, can we talk?" I nodded, keeping my tone casual. "Yeah, sure, what's up?" He hesitated, glancing toward the kitchen where Laura was clattering dishes in the sink. I don't know, man. I've been feeling weird since yesterday. About everything." "Everything?" I asked, feigning ignorance. "What do you mean?" Zack rubbed the back of his neck, clearly struggling to find the right words. "I don't know, just us. You, me, Laura. It's like something's off, you know?" I let his words hang in the air, watching as he squirmed under the weight of his own thoughts. "Yeah," I said finally, my voice calm and measured. "I felt it too." His eyes widened slightly, not expecting me to agree so easily. "Really?" "Yeah," I continued, my gaze steady. "Sometimes things aren't what they seem. People change. Relationships change. You just have to be prepared for it." Zack looked like he wanted to say more, but he held back, unsure of what he could admit without giving himself away. I could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear that had been slowly building since the boat incident. He was starting to doubt everything, and that's exactly what I wanted. Laura joined us a few minutes later, forcing a smile as she sat down on the couch. "What are you two talking about?" "Nothing important," I said quickly, cutting Zack off before he could respond. "Just catching up." She nodded, but the tension was still there, lingering in the room like an unspoken accusation. We spent the rest of the day pretending to enjoy each other's company, playing cards, watching movies, doing anything to avoid the real issues simmering beneath the surface. But no matter what we did, the awkwardness never went away. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Laura suggested we make a fire and roast marshmallows. It was an attempt to bring some normalcy back, to recapture the camaraderie we once had, but it felt forced. Zack and Laura were both on edge, their laughter strained, their smiles thin. I watched them from across the fire, the flames flickering in the growing darkness. Zack was trying too hard to keep the mood light, making jokes that fell flat, while Laura kept stealing glances at him. Her expression a mix of guilt and longing. It was obvious that the boat incident had shaken them both, but now, there was something else, a growing realization that the cracks in their little secret were starting to show. At one point Zack got up to grab more firewood, leaving Laura and me alone. She stared into the flames, her face illuminated by the soft glow. For a moment she looked vulnerable, like the weight of her choices was finally catching up to her. "Tom," she said quietly, her voice trembling, "I feel like something's wrong between us." I kept my eyes on the fire, not wanting to give away anything. "What makes you say that?" She hesitated, struggling to put her feelings into words. "I don't know. You've just been different, distant. And yesterday, on the lake, I don't know, it scared me." I turned to look at her, taking in the fear in her eyes. This was the first time she had really let her guard down, the first time she had shown that she was scared of losing control. I could have said anything at that moment, confronted her, demanded answers, but instead, I leaned back, keeping my voice calm and steady. "Laura, things happen. We all make mistakes. It's how we deal with them that matters." She blinked, confused by my words, but she didn't press further. Zack returned, breaking the silence, and we all fell back into the uneasy routine of pretending that everything was fine. As the fire died down, we headed back inside, each of us retreating to our own corners of the cabin. Laura went to bed early. Zack mumbled something about checking his emails, and I stayed up, staring out the window at the dark, still lake. They thought the worst was behind them, but they had no idea that this was only the beginning. I had them right where I wanted, unsure, unraveling, and terrified of what would come next. And soon enough I'd make sure they'd feel every bit of the fear and guilt they'd earned. The following morning, the atmosphere in the cabin was even more strained. The silence was no longer awkward, it was oppressive, like a thick fog that none of us could see through. Laura moved around the kitchen with robotic precision, making breakfast without saying a word. Zack sat at the table, staring at his coffee like it held the answers to his problems. I watched them both, savoring the unease that was slowly consuming them. I knew it was time to take the next step. They were already on edge, their nerves frayed, and I was ready to tighten the noose. Over breakfast, I suggested one last activity before we packed up and headed home, a hike along the lake's trail. It was one of our old traditions, something we'd done countless times before, but now it was laced with tension neither of them could shake. "You guys up for it?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "We've got a few hours before we need to head back. Might as well make the most of it." Laura hesitated, glancing at Zack as if seeking his approval. Zack, still trying to play the role of the carefree friend, forced a smile. "Yeah, sure, a hike sounds good. We could use some fresh air." Laura nodded, though I could tell she wasn't entirely convinced. She looked tired, like she hadn't slept at all. I wondered if she had spent the night lying awake, haunted by her own choices. Good, I thought. She deserved every sleepless hour. We set off down the trail, the crunch of gravel beneath our feet the only sound breaking the morning stillness. I led the way, setting a steady pace, while Laura and Zack lagged behind, lost in their own world of whispered conversations and stolen glances. Every now and then I'd catch snippets of their hushed voices, Zack's reassurances, Laura's quiet replies, but I kept my focus on the path ahead, pretending not to hear. The trail wound through the woods, weaving in and out of sight of the lake. It was beautiful in the early morning light, the sun filtering through the trees, but the tension between us tainted everything. I could feel their anxiety growing with each step, every rustle of leaves making them flinch. They were paranoid and on edge, and that's exactly what I wanted. We reached a secluded spot near the water's edge, a small clearing that offered a perfect view of the lake. It was quiet, almost too quiet, and I knew it was the right place to set the final part of my plan in motion. I stopped and turned to face them, forcing a casual smile. "This spot's great, isn't it? Reminds me of that time we came here years ago." I looked directly at Laura when I said it, watching as her expression tightened, her mind clearly racing back to a happier time that now felt distant and tainted. Laura forced a smile, but it was thin and unconvincing. "Yeah, it's beautiful." I reached into my backpack and pulled out a small cooler packed with a couple of beers and snacks. "Let's take a break," I said, handing each of them a drink. "Might as well relax while we're out here." Zack took his beer, his hand still shaky, and popped it open. Laura did the same, though she barely sipped hers, her eyes flickering nervously between Zack and me. I pretended to be engrossed in the view, giving them just enough space to feel comfortable, or at least as comfortable as they could be under the circumstances. After a few minutes I set my beer down and pulled out my phone, pretending to check messages. I knew they were watching me, waiting for any sign of what I was really thinking, but I kept my face blank. Then, casually, as if it were just an afterthought, I turned to Zack. "Hey, I've been meaning to ask," I said, keeping my voice light. "What were you and Laura talking about last night by the fire? You guys seemed deep in conversation." Zack choked on his beer, his eyes wide with surprise. Laura stiffened, the blood draining from her face. They exchanged a quick, panicked glance before Zack fumbled for a response. "Oh, nothing serious," he stammered, trying to play it off. "Just, talking about old times." I nodded, pretending to accept his answer, but I could see the fear in his eyes, the realization that every word he spoke was a potential trap. Laura looked like she wanted to disappear, her hands trembling as she set her beer down. "Funny how old times seem to come up a lot lately," I said, my tone deliberately casual. "Makes you think about how much has changed, huh?" Zack swallowed hard, his usual bravado completely gone. "Yeah, I guess so." Laura was on the verge of tears, and for a moment I almost felt a pang of something close to sympathy. Almost. But then I remembered the footage, the lies, the betrayal that had been playing out right under my nose, and any trace of pity evaporated. This was the price they had to pay. I stood up, dusted off my jeans, and looked at the lake one last time. "We should head back," I said, my voice firm. "Time to pack up." Neither of them argued. We walked back in near silence, the only sound the occasional snap of twigs underfoot and the distant call of birds. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was high, and it was clear that any pretense of normalcy was gone. Laura and Zack were unraveling, and I could see that they were finally starting to understand that nothing they did could fix what had been broken. We packed up the car without a word. Laura tried to hold Zack's hand at one point, but he pulled away, guilt and fear written all over his face. I watched them from the driver's seat, knowing that the cracks between them were growing deeper with every passing second. As we drove away from the lake, I couldn't help but feel a dark satisfaction. The perfect couple, the perfect friends, reduced to nothing but whispers and regrets. They thought the worst was over, but they still didn't realize that the real consequences were waiting for them back home. And when we got there, I'd be ready to show them exactly how far I was willing to go. The drive back home was agonizingly quiet. Laura sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, her fingers fidgeting nervously in her lap. Zack was in the back, pretending to sleep, but I could see his restlessness shifting out of the corner of my eye. I kept my focus on the road, masking my satisfaction with a calm expression. They thought the nightmare was behind them, but I was just getting started. We pulled up to our house in the late afternoon. Laura and Zack were slow to get out, both of them clearly exhausted, not just from the trip, but from the weight of their own guilt. I popped the trunk and began unloading the bags. Zack mumbled something about needing to get home, avoiding eye contact as he grabbed his stuff and made a quick exit. Laura didn't even look at him as he left. Once inside, Laura headed straight for the bedroom, muttering about needing a shower. I watched her retreat down the hallway, her steps heavy and sluggish. She hadn't said a word to me since the hike, and I could feel her unraveling. I set the bags down in the living room and took a deep breath, knowing that this was the moment I'd been waiting for. I walked into our bedroom, the sound of running water echoing from the bathroom. Laura's phone was on the nightstand, buzzing intermittently with notifications she hadn't bothered to check. I picked it up, scrolling through messages from her friends, family, and Zack, conversations filled with casual exchanges and hidden subtexts. I found the recent chat with Zack, the one that started innocently enough but quickly shifted into a string of messages that told a different story. "Zack, yesterday was rough, you okay?" Laura, "I don't know. I feel like everything's falling apart." Zack, "Just stay calm, we'll figure it out." It was the kind of dialogue that told me everything I needed to know. Their little secret was eating away at them, and they were desperately clinging to whatever shreds of their connection remained. I couldn't help but feel a twisted sense of triumph. They were so busy trying to keep their stories straight that they didn't even realize how thoroughly they'd been caught. I put the phone back down just as Laura stepped out of the bathroom, wrapped in a towel. She froze when she saw me standing there, her eyes darting to her phone before settling back on me. "You're home early," she said, trying to sound casual, but her voice wavered. "I thought you were still unpacking." "I was," I said, my tone even. "Just wanted to check on you." She gave a strained smile, brushing past me as she headed to the closet. "I'm fine, just tired." I watched her for a moment, noting the way she avoided my gaze, and how she moved like she was trying to escape my presence. I could have confronted her right then and laid everything out, but I wanted her to keep twisting in the wind a little longer. Instead, I turned and walked out of the room, letting the silence hang between us. Later that evening, we sat in the living room pretending to watch TV. Laura was on her phone, scrolling mindlessly through social media, while I half listened to the background noise of some forgettable show. It was the kind of mundane moment that used to feel comfortable, but now it was suffocating. I waited until she seemed distracted before speaking. "I ran into Zack's wife Kelly the other day," I said casually. "She was asking about the trip." Laura stiffened, her fingers pausing mid-scroll. "Oh, what did you tell her?" "Not much," I replied, keeping my eyes on the screen. "Just that we had a good time." She seemed interested though, like she was curious about something. Laura's face paled slightly, but she tried to keep her expression neutral. "Well, it was just a regular trip. Nothing special." "Yeah," I said, leaning back on the couch. "But you know Kelly, she's always looking for something that isn't there." I could see the panic flash briefly across Laura's face. She was beginning to realize that the walls were closing in, that this wasn't just about the two of us anymore. I let her sit with that thought, enjoying the way she squirmed under the pressure. Before bed, Laura tried to make small talk, clearly trying to gauge my mood. She asked about work, about plans for the weekend, anything to fill the silence that was now unbearable for her. I played along, answering with short, vague responses that gave nothing away. I wanted her to feel the distance between us, the growing chasm that she had helped create. That night, I lay awake, listening to the rhythmic sounds of Laura's breathing beside me. She was restless, tossing and turning, lost in whatever nightmare was playing out in her head. I stared at the ceiling, going over every detail of what I'd seen on those hidden cameras. The betrayal, the lies, the moments where she looked at Zack with the kind of longing she used to save for me. It all played out in my mind like a movie I couldn't turn off. Around 2 a.m. I slipped out of bed and made my way to the kitchen. I poured myself a glass of water and stood in the dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the oven clock. I couldn't sleep, not with everything I knew now, and I felt the simmering anger beneath my calm exterior. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming my own sense of control. As I stared out into the quiet street, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a message from Zack. "We need to talk." "Tomorrow?" I smirked, knowing exactly what that meant. He was feeling the heat too, and he was desperate for reassurance. I typed a quick response. "Sure. Let's catch up." When I returned to bed, Laura was still asleep, her face soft and unguarded in the moonlight. For a brief moment, she looked like the woman I used to love, the one I thought I knew, but that image was shattered now, replaced by the cold reality of what she'd become. I lay down beside her, feeling nothing but the weight of everything that had been broken between us. Tomorrow would be the beginning of the end, and I was ready to watch it all come crashing down. The next day, I arranged to meet Zack at a quiet cafe on the other side of town, far from the familiar places we usually hung out. It was a spot we'd never been to together, which suited me perfectly. It felt neutral, disconnected from the past that was now poisoned by betrayal. Zack arrived a few minutes late, looking haggard and uneasy. He spotted me sitting at a corner table and forced a weak smile, but I could see the anxiety etched on his face. "Hey man," he said, pulling out a chair. "Thanks for meeting up." "No problem," I replied, keeping my tone light. "Figured it was time we caught up, just the two of us." Zack ordered a coffee, his hands tapping nervously on the table as he waited for it to arrive. I watched him carefully, noting the way he avoided eye contact and the tension in his shoulders. He was unraveling, and I was about to give him the final push. "So," I said, leaning back in my chair, "what's on your mind?" Zack hesitated, staring down at his coffee cup. He was trying to find the right words, trying to measure how much he could say without exposing himself completely. But he didn't realize that it didn't matter anymore. I already knew everything. "It's about Laura," he began slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "And us. I've been feeling like, I don't know, like something's not right between you two. I mean, I know you guys are going through a rough patch, but it feels like more than that." I nodded, pretending to mull over his words. "Yeah, things have been tough, but it's not just us, is it, Zack? Feels like everyone's been acting a little off lately." He stiffened, the color draining from his face. "What do you mean?" I leaned forward, my gaze piercing. "Come on, man. Do you think I haven't noticed? The tension, the secrets, the whispers between you and Laura. You two think you're being careful, but it's obvious something's going on." Zack's eyes widened, and for a moment, he looked like a deer caught in headlights. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He was choking on his own lies, caught between the need to confess and the desperate hope that he could still deny everything. "I don't know what you're talking about," he finally stammered, his voice shaky. I smirked, letting his denial hang in the air. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. I've seen the messages, Zack, the late-night conversations, the meetings when you thought I was busy. I've seen everything." Zack's face went pale, and he slumped back in his chair, defeated. He looked like he'd just been punched in the gut, all his bravado stripped away. Tom, You don't need to explain, I cut him off, my voice cold and even. I already know. I've known for a while now. The cabin trip, the lake, it was all part of the plan. I wanted you to feel the weight of what you've done. And now I want you to live with it. He sat there in stunned silence, his hands trembling as he tried to process my words. The reality of the situation was crashing down on him, and there was no way out. I let the silence stretch, enjoying the discomfort radiating off him. Tom, I'm sorry, he finally said, his voice breaking. I never meant for any of this to happen. It just got out of hand. I leaned back, keeping my expression unreadable. Out of hand? Do you think that's all this is? You betrayed me, Zack. You both did. And now you're sorry because you got caught. He shook his head, burying his face in his hands. I don't know what to say. I messed up, man. I've messed everything up. I stared at him, feeling a strange mix of anger and satisfaction. Zack was right. He had messed everything up and there was no going back. But watching him crumble in front of me, I realized that no apology could ever fix what he'd destroyed. You've got a lot to think about, I said, standing up and tossing a few bills on the table. But here's the thing. You're not the only one who's going to pay for this. Laura's not innocent, and neither are you. You both made your choices and now you're going to live with them. Zack looked up at me, his eyes filled with regret. Tom, please, save it, I snapped, cutting him off. You're not the victim here. You've been lying to my face for months. You thought you could have your fun and keep everything intact. Well, guess what? You were wrong. I turned and walked away, leaving Zack slumped at the table, drowning in his own guilt. As I stepped out of the cafe and into the bright afternoon sun, I felt a surge of grim satisfaction. This was just the beginning of their downfall, the first crack in the facade they had built. They were so desperate to keep their secret, but now it was out in the open. Exposed for what it was, a betrayal that could never be undone. I got in my car and sat there for a moment, replaying the conversation in my head. Zack's pathetic excuses, his frantic attempts to explain away his actions, it was all meaningless. The damage was done, and there was no way for them to repair what they'd broken. I pulled out my phone and typed a quick message to Laura. I talked to Zack. We need to have a serious conversation tonight. I didn't wait for her response. I put the car in drive and headed home, knowing that tonight would be the final reckoning. Laura and Zack thought they could outsmart me, but they were wrong. I was in control now, and I was going to make sure they felt every ounce of the pain they'd caused. As I drove, I could feel the weight lifting off my shoulders. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was taking back my life, piece by piece, and I wasn't going to stop until they were left with nothing but the ruins of their choices. Tonight everything would come to light and there would be no more secrets left between us. When I got home, the house was dark and quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Laura was in the living room, sitting on the couch with her legs pulled up to her chest, staring blankly at the TV that wasn't even turned on. She looked up as I walked in, her face a mix of worry and dread. I could tell she'd been anxiously waiting for me ever since I sent that message. Tom, what's going on? She asked, her voice tense. I've been sitting here for hours. Why did you talk to Zack? What did he say? I set my keys down on the counter and took a deep breath, steadying myself. This was the moment I had been building toward, the one that would finally lay everything bare. There was no turning back now. We need to talk, I said, my tone controlled but firm, and I need you to be completely honest with me. No more lies. Laura's eyes widened, her fear palpable. She glanced away, her fingers gripping the couch cushions as if she could hold herself together that way. Tom, you're scaring me. What is this about? I walked over to the coffee table and sat down across from her, meeting her gaze directly. It's about you and Zack. It's about everything you two have been hiding from me. The texts, the meetups, the nights you thought I was clueless. I know, Laura. I've known for a while. Her face went white, and for a split second, I saw the guilt flash in her eyes before she quickly masked it with shock. What? No, that's not Tom. It's not what you think. Zack and I. Stop, I interrupted, holding up a hand. Don't lie to me. Not now. I've seen the footage, Laura. I set up cameras around the house weeks ago. I saw everything. She froze, her mouth hanging open as she processed what I'd just said. The weight of my words hit her like a punch, and I could see the panic set in. She looked at me, then at the floor, her whole body trembling. Oh my God. Tom, I never wanted you to find out like this. I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in the otherwise silent room. That's what you're worried about? How I found out? You should have been worried about what would happen when I did. Tears welled up in her eyes and she buried her face in her hands. She was crumbling, and I felt a twisted satisfaction watching it unfold. This was the woman who had lied to me, who had looked me in the eyes every day while sneaking around with my best friend. And now the reality of her actions was crashing down on her. "I'm sorry," she sobbed, her voice muffled. "I was so stupid. It was a mistake. I never meant for it to go this far." "A mistake?" I repeated, my voice rising. "It wasn't just a one-time thing, Laura. You didn't just trip and fall into his arms. This was planned, over and over again. You made a choice, every single time." She lifted her head, her face streaked with tears. "Tom, I swear I didn't want to hurt you. I love you." I shook my head, feeling nothing but cold disdain. "Love? Do you think that's love? Sneaking around behind my back with Zack, lying to my face every day? You call that love?" Laura broke down completely, sobbing uncontrollably, but her tears did nothing to move me. I was past feeling sorry for her. All I could think about was the betrayal, the lies, and the way they both thought they could get away with it. "Why, Laura?" I demanded, my voice sharp. "Why him? Why now?" She struggled to find her words, choking on her guilt. "I don't know. It just happened. I was feeling lost and Zack was there. He made me feel seen and understood. But it was wrong. I know that now. Feeling lost doesn't justify what you did," I said, my anger boiling over. "You had every opportunity to tell me you were unhappy, to fix things, but instead you chose the easy way out. You chose to cheat." She nodded, her shoulders shaking with each sob. "I know, and I hate myself for it. I hate what I've done to you." I stood up, the adrenaline coursing through me, making it impossible to sit still. "You've destroyed everything, Laura, and now you get to live with it. I've filed for divorce. Papers will be served soon." She looked up at me, horrified. "Tom, please don't do this. We can work through it. I'll do anything. I'll go to therapy. There's nothing left to fix." I cut her off, my voice cold and final. "This is the consequence of your actions. You and Zack will have to live with what you've done." Laura collapsed into herself, sobbing quietly on the couch. The sight of her, broken, guilt-ridden, should have made me feel something, but it didn't. I was numb. The part of me that once loved her was gone, replaced by the bitter truth of who she really was. I turned and walked to the door, grabbing my keys without looking back. "I'll stay at a hotel tonight. You should think about where you're going to go." Laura didn't respond, her cries muffled by her hands. I left the house, closing the door softly behind me, the finality of it sinking in. This was it, the end of us, the end of whatever life we'd built together. There was no going back now. As I drove away, the night air cool against my face, I felt a strange sense of release. The truth was out, and for the first time in a long time, I felt free from the lies that had weighed me down. I didn't know what was next, but I knew one thing for certain: Laura and Zack would never forget this. They'd live with the scars of their betrayal just as I would. But unlike them, I was finally free. The morning after the confrontation, I woke up in a cheap hotel room, the kind with faded wallpaper and a flickering lamp in the corner. I stared at the ceiling, the events of the previous night playing on a loop in my mind. Laura's tear-streaked face, her frantic apologies, it all felt like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. But the pain in my chest told me it was all too real. I had ripped off the Band-Aid and exposed the wound, and now it was time to deal with the fallout. I dragged myself out of bed, the cold, impersonal feel of the hotel room reflecting the emptiness I felt inside. I didn't have much planned for the day, just a meeting with my lawyer to finalize the divorce papers and a vague notion of figuring out what the hell my life was going to look like from here on out. I tried not to think about Laura and Zack, but their faces kept creeping into my mind, like unwanted guests at a party that was long over. After a quick shower, I dressed and headed to a nearby diner. The smell of stale coffee and frying bacon filled the air, and I slid into a booth in the corner, trying to disappear into the noise of clinking dishes and murmured conversations. I pulled out my phone, checking for messages. There were a few from work, but nothing from Laura. I didn't expect her to reach out, and honestly, I wasn't sure what I'd say if she did. As I sipped my coffee, my mind wandered back to Zack. I hadn't heard from him since our meeting at the cafe, and I figured he was probably doing damage control, scrambling to keep his own life from falling apart. I wondered if he had told Kelly, or if he was still trying to hide the truth, grasping at whatever lies he had left. Either way, it didn't matter to me. They were both caught in their own web, and I was done playing their game. A familiar voice snapped me out of my thoughts. I looked up to see Kelly standing at the counter, placing a to-go order. She hadn't noticed me yet, her focus on the cashier, but I knew it was only a matter of time. I considered slipping out quietly, avoiding the inevitable awkward conversation, but something made me stay. I wanted to see her face, to gauge if she knew the truth, or if she was still living in the dark like I had been. Kelly finally turned around, her eyes scanning the diner until they landed on me. For a moment she hesitated, as if deciding whether to approach. Then she sighed and walked over, her expression a mix of surprise and something else I couldn't quite read. "Tom," she said, forcing a smile, "didn't expect to see you here." I gestured to the empty seat across from me. "Yeah, just grabbing some breakfast. Want to join?" She glanced at the clock on her phone but nodded, sitting down gingerly as if the booth might break under the weight of unspoken words. We made small talk at first, work, the weather, the usual pleasantries, but it was clear we were both skirting around the real issue. She looked tired, like she hadn't slept in days, and I could see the faint smudges of mascara under her eyes. "I haven't seen much of Zack lately," Kelly finally said, her voice edged with suspicion. "He's been distant. Says he's working late, but I don't know. Something doesn't feel right." I watched her closely, weighing my next words. She deserved to know the truth, but there was a part of me that hated the idea of dragging her into this mess. She was innocent in all of it, and I knew the news would shatter whatever illusions she had left. "Kelly," I began carefully, "there's something you need to know about Zack." She leaned in, her eyes searching mine. "What is it? What's going on?" I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what I was about to say. "Zack's been having an affair with Laura." Her reaction was immediate, a sharp intake of breath, followed by a look of pure devastation. She blinked rapidly as if trying to process the words that had just come out of my mouth. No, that can't be true. Zack wouldn't. He wouldn't do that." "I'm sorry, Kelly," I said, my voice low. "I found out weeks ago. I didn't want to believe it either, but I saw the proof. Texts, calls, everything." I confronted them both and they couldn't deny it. Tears welled up in Kelly's eyes, and she covered her mouth with her hand, struggling to hold herself together. I wanted to comfort her, but I knew there was nothing I could say that would make this any easier. She had to go through the same painful realization that I had, and there was no shortcut through that kind of betrayal. "How long?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "How long has this been going on?" I hesitated, knowing the answer would only make things worse. "A few months, maybe longer. I don't know exactly, but it doesn't matter now. They lied to us, both of them." Kelly sat back, her expression hardening as anger began to replace her shock. I knew something was off. I could feel it, but I never thought, "God, I feel so stupid." "You're not stupid," I said firmly. "They're the ones who messed up, not us. They made their choices and now they have to live with them." She nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "What are you going to do?" "I've already filed for divorce," I replied, my voice steady. "I'm done with Laura and I'm done with Zack. You should think about what you want to do next." Kelly stared at the table, her fingers tracing patterns on the worn surface. "I don't know. I need time to think. To figure out what comes next." I nodded, understanding all too well the feeling of being lost, adrift in a sea of broken promises. "Take your time. Don't let them rush you into anything." We sat in silence for a while, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The pain was still fresh and the wounds were deep, but there was a strange sense of camaraderie in our shared betrayal. We were victims of the same lie, caught in the same storm, and now it was up to us to find a way through the wreckage. As Kelly got up to leave, she looked at me with a newfound determination in her eyes. "Thank you, Tom, for telling me the truth. I needed to hear it, even if it hurts." "Take care of yourself, Kelly," I said, watching as she walked away. As she disappeared through the diner's door, I finished my coffee and sat back, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. The truth was finally out, and though it didn't erase the pain, it was a step toward healing. I didn't know what the future held for me, for Kelly, or for the broken pieces of our lives, but one thing was clear. Zack and Laura would have to face the consequences of their actions, and they'd have to do it without us. We were free now, free to rebuild, to move forward, and to find peace beyond the lies that had once chained us. I spent the next few days trying to pick up the pieces of my life, but every corner I turned seemed to be haunted by the memories of what Laura and Zack had done. Our house felt emptier than ever, each room a reminder of the lies that had unraveled everything I thought I knew. I tried to avoid going back, staying at hotels or crashing at friends' places, but eventually, I knew I had to face it. The walls of that house were holding secrets I needed to confront before I could truly let go. One afternoon, I went back to pack some of my things. Laura was out, probably staying with her sister, who had called me a few times, begging me to reconsider the divorce. But I wasn't interested in hearing Laura's excuses filtered through someone else's mouth. I had made up my mind. As I walked through the house, I noticed little things I hadn't before, like the way Laura had rearranged the books on the shelf, almost as if trying to create some semblance of order in the chaos we'd created. There were small signs of her attempts to move on, but all they did was remind me of the deceit that had taken root in our lives. I was in the bedroom, packing my clothes into a duffel bag when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Zack. I hadn't heard from him since the day I confronted Laura, and seeing his name light up my screen filled me with a mix of anger and disgust. "Zack, we need to talk. Please Tom, just hear me out." I stared at the message, my finger hovering over the delete button. Every part of me wanted to ignore him, to shut him out completely, but there was a part of me that needed closure, needed to hear what pathetic excuse he had to offer. I decided to meet him, if only to make sure he knew the full extent of the damage he'd caused. We met at a quiet park near the edge of town, the kind of place where we used to hang out back in college. It was supposed to be neutral ground, but nothing felt neutral anymore. The tension was thick as I walked up to the bench where Zack was waiting, his shoulders slumped and his face lined with guilt. "Thanks for coming," he said, standing up awkwardly as I approached. I didn't bother with pleasantries. "What do you want, Zack?" He looked down, stuffing his hands into his jacket pockets like a scolded child. "I'm sorry, Tom. I've been trying to figure out how to say it, but I know it doesn't matter. I messed up. I messed up everything. You think an apology fixes this?" I snapped, my anger boiling over. "You were my best friend, Zack. We've been through everything together. And you threw it all away for what? A few stolen moments with Laura?" He flinched at my words, the weight of them sinking in. "I don't have an excuse. I was selfish and I let things get out of control. I never meant to hurt you." "But you did," I said coldly. "And you hurt Kelly too. Does she know? Have you told her?" Zack's expression crumbled and he looked away, his voice barely above a whisper. "I told her last night. She's leaving me and I don't blame her." Good, I thought. He deserved every ounce of pain coming his way. But as much as I wanted to unleash every ounce of anger I had left, I could see that Zack was already paying for his mistakes. His life was unraveling, just like mine, and there was no satisfaction in kicking a man when he was already down. "I don't care what happens to you anymore, Zack," I said, my voice tired. "I'm done with you, and I'm done with Laura. I hope you both find a way to live with what you've done because I'm moving on." Zack nodded, wiping a hand across his face. "I'm sorry, Tom. I know those words mean nothing, but it's all I have." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. I turned and walked away, feeling lighter with every step I took. This chapter of my life was over, and while the scars would always be there, I was ready to start fresh, far away from the lies and betrayals that had poisoned everything. As I drove away from the park, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the road ahead. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, I could rebuild from this wreckage. Laura and Zack had shattered my trust, but they hadn't destroyed me, and that I realized was something they would never take away. The future was uncertain, but it was mine, and I was determined to make the most of it. With Zack and Laura finally out of my life, I threw myself into work, into routines, into anything that could distract me from the gaping hole they'd left behind. I had filed for divorce, cut off Zack completely, and was doing my best to carve out a new existence for myself. But there was one thing I couldn't shake: revenge. As much as I tried to let go, the betrayal kept festering inside me like an untreated wound, refusing to heal. I needed to do something that would make them feel the fear and uncertainty they had forced on me. So I started planning. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision, it was deliberate, meticulous. I needed them to feel vulnerable, to question everything. The idea came to me late one night as I sat in my darkened living room, staring at the flickering light of the street lamp outside. The cabin trip, that was where I would finally make my move. It was where I'd set everything straight. Zack and Laura had no idea what was coming. When I reached out to Zack, I played the part of the heartbroken but forgiving friend. It was easy enough to fake. I knew exactly what to say to appeal to his guilt. I proposed a final attempt to mend things, a camping trip upstate, just like we used to do back in college. Laura was hesitant at first, but Zack convinced her. He was desperate to make amends, to believe that we could somehow all move on. He still didn't understand that there was no going back, no fixing this. On the day of the trip, I packed the car with all the essentials, making sure everything looked perfect. Zack and Laura arrived at my place, both of them visibly tense, but I put on my best performance, acting like I was ready to let the past go. We drove up to the lake in near silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between us. The cabin was nestled deep in the woods, far from any cell service, surrounded by tall pines that loomed like silent witnesses to what I was about to do. The first night, I played nice. We made awkward small talk, grilled burgers on the fire, and tried to pretend things were normal. Zack kept glancing at me as if waiting for some sign that we were okay, that the betrayal could be forgiven. Laura was quieter, avoiding my eyes and sipping on her wine like it was the only thing holding her together. I watched them closely, every twitch, every nervous glance filing it away. They were on edge, and that was exactly how I wanted them. The next morning, I suggested we take the boat out on the lake, just like old times. Zack hesitated, but I reassured him, playing the role of the friend who was willing to put it all behind us. Laura seemed reluctant, but I could see the cracks forming in her resolve. She wanted so badly for this to be real, for everything to go back to how it was. Little did they know, this was all just a setup. The lake was serene, the water reflecting the clear blue sky above. We paddled out to the middle, the cabin shrinking into the distance. Zack tried to make conversation, asking about work, trying to bridge the unspoken chasm between us. I gave short, polite answers, my mind focused on what was about to happen. Once we were far enough out, I accidentally knocked over a cooler, sending drinks and food tumbling into the lake. I made a show of trying to catch them, shifting my weight just enough to tip the balance of the boat. Suddenly it started to tilt. Zack lunged to one side to steady it, but I yanked the other way, making the boat rock violently. Before they knew it, we were all in the water, the boat capsizing and leaving us flailing. I could see the panic in Laura's eyes as she struggled to keep her head above water. Zack swam toward her, his instincts kicking in, but there was nothing to hold on to. The boat was drifting further away, and the shore seemed impossibly far. I stayed calm, treading water with just enough effort to keep myself afloat, watching as fear took hold of them both. Zack's voice wavered as he called out, "Tom, help us get the boat." But I didn't move. I just watched, letting them feel every second of helplessness. They were in no real danger. I knew they could swim, and the shore, though distant, was reachable. But I wanted them to feel the way I had felt, lost, powerless, unsure of what was going to happen next. Minutes passed and their panic grew. Zack kept trying to right the boat, his movements frantic, but it was no use. Laura was crying, her voice cracking as she pleaded, "Tom, please help." I finally swam over, pretending to be struggling myself, and together we managed to get the boat back upright. We climbed in, all of us soaked and shivering, the unspoken reality of what had just happened settling over us like a heavy fog. They didn't know I had done it on purpose, but they sensed something had changed. The fragile trust they were clinging to had been shaken. We rowed back in silence, the tension thicker than ever. Zack kept glancing at me, his eyes searching for some hint of the friend he thought he knew. Laura stayed quiet, hugging herself and staring at the water as if it held the answers she couldn't find. As we reached the shore, I knew they were rattled. This was the beginning of their unraveling, the first taste of the fear and uncertainty I wanted them to live with. They had betrayed me, and now it was their turn to question everything. That night, as we sat around the campfire, I watched them closely, their expressions haunted by what had happened on the lake. They were trapped in their own guilt, and it was eating them alive. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had regained control. They had taken everything from me, but they would never take my resolve. This was my game now, and I wasn't done playing. The rest of the trip was a tense, awkward dance around the truth none of us could bring ourselves to speak. Zack and Laura were visibly shaken after the incident on the lake, though they tried to play it off as just a freak accident. I let them believe it, let them cling to the fragile hope that things were still salvageable. But beneath my calm exterior, I was already plotting the next step. The final blow that would leave no doubt about the consequences of their betrayal. We packed up the cabin and headed back to the city. The car ride was painfully quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I dropped Zack off at his place first, barely acknowledging his strained attempt at a smile. Laura was next, and she gave me a long, searching look before she got out, as if she was trying to find some trace of the man she once knew. But I had nothing left to give her, nothing but the last act of my plan. I spent the next few days gathering the final pieces I needed. The divorce papers were already in motion, and I had emptied out our joint accounts, leaving just enough for Laura to cover basic expenses while I made arrangements to move out for good. I changed all the passwords to our shared accounts and removed her from everything that tied us together. Laura would have to start from scratch, and that was only the beginning. But the real blow would come at the office. I had spent years building up my career, putting in the hours and climbing the ranks. Zack, of course, was my partner in most of it. We had built our success together, and we both had access to sensitive information that could make or break us. What Zack didn't know was that I had been collecting evidence, emails, financial discrepancies, deals he had made behind the scenes that were less than ethical. Zack always liked to cut corners, but I had kept a clean record of everything. With a few strategic moves, I sent the evidence anonymously to the board of directors. It wasn't enough to get him jailed, but it was enough to ruin his reputation, to cast doubt on every deal he'd ever made. Zack would lose his job, his status, and any chance at rebuilding his life the way he'd envisioned it. He'd be left with nothing, just like I was when I first found out about the affair. The fallout was immediate. The company launched an internal investigation, and Zack's name was dragged through the mud. His calls to me became more frequent, desperate voicemails begging me to help him, to use my influence to make it all go away. But I didn't answer. I let him drown in the mess he'd made, just like he had done to me. Laura, on the other hand, had her own problems to deal with. News of the affair had spread, and friends we once shared turned their backs on her. She was isolated, clinging to whatever scraps of sympathy she could find, but there was no one left who wanted to hear her side of the story. I heard through mutual friends that she had moved in with her sister temporarily, trying to piece together some semblance of a life. But every step was a struggle, and every day was a reminder of the choices she had made. One evening, I went back to the house for the last time to collect the few remaining things I had left behind. The place was exactly as I remembered it, yet it felt like a stranger's home. As I walked through the empty rooms, I couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. This chapter was finally ending, and I was ready to turn the page. On the kitchen counter, I found a letter addressed to me in Laura's handwriting. I debated whether to read it, but ultimately unfolded the paper. It was short, filled with apologies and promises that were too little, too late. Laura begged for another chance, saying she had made a terrible mistake, but it read more like a confession than an appeal for forgiveness. It was clear she knew what she had lost, and now she had to live with the consequences. I didn't respond. I folded the letter and left it on the counter, untouched and unanswered, just like all the questions I would never get closure on. A few days later, the divorce was finalized and I officially cut ties with Laura and Zack. They were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, haunted by the choices that had led them to this point. Zack lost his job, and Laura was left alone, the reality of her decisions weighing heavily on her shoulders. As for me, I moved forward, scarred but determined. I found a new apartment in a part of town where the memories of my old life couldn't reach me. I spent my days rebuilding, focusing on work and slowly reclaiming my sense of self. There were no more hidden cameras, no more schemes. I had done what I needed to do and now I was free. One evening, as I sat in my new living room, watching the city lights flicker through the window, I thought about everything that had happened. There was no satisfaction in what I'd done, no triumphant victory, but there was peace in knowing that I hadn't let their betrayal define me. I had taken control of my story, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could finally breathe. Zack and Laura would always be a part of my past, but they no longer had any power over my future. I had made sure of that. The weeks that followed were a blur of new beginnings and unfamiliar routines. I threw myself into my new life, determined to leave behind the wreckage of the past. The divorce was final, the house was sold, and I moved into my new apartment, a sleek, modern place with big windows and no memories. It was a clean slate, a chance to start over without the shadows of Laura and Zack haunting every corner. Work became my sanctuary. With Zack out of the picture, I was given a chance to step up, to take on the responsibilities we used to share. The board was impressed with how I handled the fallout from Zack's mess, and I played my cards right, using every bit of leverage I had to climb higher. My days were filled with meetings, late nights at the office, and a focus that bordered on obsession. It was easier to lose myself in work than to face the quiet moments when the loneliness crept in. I hadn't spoken to Zack since the day I left him at the lake. His attempts to contact me dwindled after he lost his job. I heard through the grapevine that he was struggling to find new work, his reputation tainted by the scandal. No one wanted to take a risk on someone with a history of shady deals. As for Laura, she had reached out once or twice, emails filled with apologies and attempts to explain, but I never responded. There was nothing left to say. One evening, after another long day at the office, I found myself sitting at a bar near my apartment, nursing a drink and watching the city buzz around me. The bartender, a young guy with a friendly smile, struck up a conversation, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to relax. We talked about nothing important, sports, the weather, random bits of news, but it was nice to feel normal, to connect with someone who didn't know my story. As the night wore on, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The anger that had driven me for so long was beginning to fade, replaced by something else, acceptance maybe, or at least the beginnings of it. I knew I wasn't the same person I was before the affair, but that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. I had learned a lot about myself, about what I could endure, and what I was capable of when pushed to the edge. A few weeks later, I received a call from Kelly, Zack's wife. I hadn't spoken to her since everything went down, and her name flashing on my screen took me by surprise. I hesitated before answering, unsure of what to expect. "Hey Tom," she said, her voice softer than I remembered. "I've been meaning to call you, Kelly. It's been a while," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Yeah, I know. I wanted to check in. I heard about everything, and I'm sorry for what you went through. Zack told me some things, but I don't think I ever got the whole story." I could hear the sadness in her voice, the exhaustion of someone who had been blindsided just like me. "You don't owe me any apologies, Kelly. None of this was your fault." "I know," she sighed. "But I still feel like I should have seen it coming. I should have been there for you and for him in some way that could have stopped all of this." I didn't have the heart to tell her that there was nothing she could have done. Some betrayals run too deep, and the damage was already done long before either of us knew. But talking to Kelly was oddly comforting, a reminder that I wasn't alone in picking up the pieces. "I'm moving back to my parents' place for a while," Kelly continued. "I need a fresh start. I just wanted to let you know that I'm here if you ever need to talk. We've both been through hell, and I figure it doesn't hurt to have someone who understands." "Thanks, Kelly. I appreciate that," I said, meaning it more than I expected. After we hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at my phone and feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. It was like closing the door on the last chapter of this mess, knowing that while none of us would ever be the same, we still had a chance to find our way forward. As the days turned into weeks, I started to feel lighter. The weight of everything that had happened was still there, but it no longer defined me. I went out more, met new people, and slowly began to rebuild a version of my life that felt like mine again. There were still rough days, moments when the past would sneak up on me, but they were becoming fewer and farther between. One Saturday, I decided to take a walk by the lake, the same one where I had orchestrated Zack and Laura's moment of fear. The water was calm, shimmering under the afternoon sun, and I found a spot on the shore where I could sit and just watch the world go by. It felt symbolic in a way, returning to the place where everything had shifted, but this time with no agenda, no anger, just the quiet understanding that life moves on. I watched as a couple paddled out in a small boat, laughing as they tried to keep their balance. They were carefree, enjoying the moment, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel bitterness watching them. I felt hopeful. As I stood up to leave, I took one last look at the lake, the memories swirling in the gentle waves. I knew I would never forget what had happened, but I also knew I was done letting it control me. Zack and Laura were a chapter of my life that had ended, and now, it was up to me to write the next one. I turned away from the water, heading back towards my new life, ready to see where it would take me. Months passed, and the shadows of the past began to fade into the background. Life was finally settling into a new rhythm, one that wasn't defined by betrayal or revenge, but by the quiet satisfaction of moving forward. I had immersed myself in work, developed new friendships, and even started going to the gym regularly, channeling my energy into rebuilding myself both mentally and physically. One evening, after wrapping up a late meeting, I stopped by my favorite coffee shop downtown. It had become my go-to spot for unwinding, a small place with soft lighting, worn leather chairs, and a wall of books that no one ever seemed to read. I ordered my usual, a black coffee, no sugar, and found a seat by the window. I watched people hurry by outside, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of streetlights, each caught up in their own lives. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. As I sipped my coffee, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was from an old college friend who had heard about everything that happened with Zack and Laura. She had sent a message out of the blue, asking if I'd be interested in catching up sometime. It was strange how word had traveled, how people I hadn't spoken to in years were suddenly reaching out, trying to offer support. But I welcomed the connections. It was nice to be reminded that not everyone was as deceitful as the two people I had once trusted most. I decided to take her up on the offer and met her for dinner later that week. It felt good to reconnect, to talk about things other than work and the mess of my recent past. Over the course of the evening, we reminisced about college days, old friends, and the winding paths our lives had taken. She told me about her new job, her upcoming travels, and the small joys she'd found in the simple things. It was a reminder that life goes on, that there's always more to the story than just the bad chapters. As we said our goodbyes, she looked at me with genuine kindness. "You're doing all right, Tom. It's good to see you moving on. You deserve better than what happened." Her words stuck with me long after she left, lingering in my mind as I walked back to my apartment. I realized that moving on wasn't just about leaving the past behind. It was about allowing myself to believe in the future again, to open up to new possibilities, even when trust felt like a fragile thing. One night, a few weeks later, I got a call from Zack. It was the first time I'd heard his voice in months. I stared at my phone, torn between the urge to hit decline and the curiosity of what he could possibly have to say. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Tom," he started, his voice heavy with regret. "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I needed to say I'm sorry. I've been trying to put my life back together, and I've been doing a lot of thinking about everything that happened. I messed up. I lost you, and I lost everything that mattered. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to hear it from me. I'm sorry." His words hung in the air, a mix of genuine remorse and the familiar undertones of Zack trying to smooth things over. There was a time when those words would have meant everything, when I would have clung to them, hoping they could undo the damage. But now they felt empty, like the final echoes of a story that no longer held any power over me. "Zack," I said calmly, "I appreciate you saying that. But we can't go back, and I don't think we should try. I've moved on, and I think you need to too." He sighed, the weight of everything settling into the silence between us. "Yeah, I get it. I wish things were different." "So do I replied, and with that, I ended the call. I sat there for a moment processing the conversation. There was no satisfaction, no closure, just the quiet recognition that Zack was no longer a part of my life, and I was okay with that. Forgiveness wasn't about absolving him, it was about releasing myself from the grip of the past. The next morning, I went for a run by the lake. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a golden glow over the water. It was the same lake where everything had come crashing down, but today it felt different. I ran along the shore, my feet pounding against the familiar path, each step taking me further from the pain that had once held me captive. As I reached the end of the trail, I paused to catch my breath, looking out at the calm surface of the water. There were no lingering ghosts, no bitter memories, just the sound of my heartbeat and the promise of a new day. I knew there would still be challenges ahead, moments when doubt and anger would try to claw their way back in, but I was ready to face them. I had rebuilt my life from the ground up, brick by brick, and I wasn't about to let the past pull me down again. I had learned to trust myself, to rely on my own strength, and to find joy in the little things, the crisp morning air, the feel of the wind on my face, the quiet confidence that I was exactly where I needed to be. Life had thrown its worst at me, but I had come out the other side, scarred but unbroken. I was no longer defined by Zack and Laura, no longer tethered to the pain they had caused. I was free to write my own story, one where I was no longer the victim, but the author of my own fate. As I turned to head back, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The lake, the city, the future, they were all mine to embrace, and for the first time in a long time I was excited to see where the next chapter would take me. Months had turned into a year since I last spoke to Zack, and my life had finally settled into a place that felt right. I had moved on in ways I never thought possible. My career was thriving, I had made new friends, and the wounds from the past had healed into faint scars, reminders of where I had been but not where I was headed. One morning I woke up early, the sun streaming through my apartment windows. It was one of those perfect days when everything feels in balance, and I decided to spend it doing something I hadn't done in a long time. Nothing. No plans, no meetings, just a day for myself. I grabbed a book, my coffee, and headed out to the park, soaking in the quiet simplicity of a life that was finally my own. As I sat on a bench, flipping through pages without really reading, I noticed a familiar face in the distance. Laura was walking down the path, looking different than I remembered, less put together, more vulnerable. She hadn't seen me yet, and for a moment I considered slipping away quietly, avoiding the inevitable awkwardness. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the realization that I was finally ready to face her, or maybe I just wanted to see her one last time, not as the woman who had betrayed me, but as a person who was struggling just like I had. She spotted me, her eyes widening in surprise before she quickly composed herself. There was a hesitant smile on her lips as she walked over, her movements careful, almost timid. "Tom," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Laura," I nodded, my tone calm and even. "It's been a while." She sat down on the other end of the bench, leaving a deliberate space between us. For a few moments we just sat there, neither of us quite sure what to say. I could see the exhaustion etched on her face, the weight of everything she'd been carrying since our lives had fallen apart. "How have you been?" she finally asked, her voice tinged with regret. "I've been meaning to reach out, but I wasn't sure if you'd want to hear from me." "I've been good," I said, realizing as I said it that it was true. "Better, actually. I've been moving forward." She nodded, looking down at her hands, fidgeting with the strap of her purse. "I'm glad. You deserve that. I've thought about what I'd say if I ever saw you again, but now that you're here, I don't know how to begin." "You don't have to," I said gently. "What's done is done, Laura. We've both paid the price for our choices." She looked up at me, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. I'm so sorry, Tom. I ruined everything, and I lost the best thing I ever had. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed you to know that. I took a deep breath, letting her words hang in the air. There was a time when I thought I needed her apology to move on, but now, sitting there, I realized that her regret was hers to bear, not mine. I had already found my peace. I've let it go, Laura, I said, my voice steady. Not for you, but for me. I had to, otherwise it would have eaten me alive. We made mistakes, both of us. But that chapter's over. She nodded, wiping a tear that had slipped down her cheek. Thank you, Tom. I hope you find happiness. Real happiness. I already have, I said, offering her a small smile. I hope you do too. With that, our conversation ended, not with a dramatic goodbye, but with the quiet understanding that we were two people who had once shared a life and were now on different paths. Laura stood up, hesitating for a moment before she walked away, a little lighter it seemed from having faced her past. I watched her disappear down the path, feeling a strange mix of relief and closure. It was the last loose end I hadn't realized I needed to tie, and now it was done. As I left the park and made my way back to my apartment, I thought about how much had changed. My life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, shaped by my own choices and no longer haunted by the ghosts of betrayal. I had come out of the darkest part of my life stronger, more self-assured, and ready for whatever came next. I found myself at a coffee shop later that afternoon, one of those new spots that had popped up recently. I ordered a coffee and sat down, scrolling through my phone when a message popped up. It was from Kelly. She was back in town for a visit and wanted to catch up. I smiled, thinking about how far we'd both come, each in our own way. Maybe there was something to be said about reconnecting, about finding new beginnings even in old friendships. I replied with a simple, "Sure, let's meet," and set my phone down, feeling a sense of anticipation for the first time in a long while. As I looked around the bustling cafe, I realized that life was moving forward, faster than I had imagined, and I was ready to keep pace. The future was wide open, a blank page waiting to be filled, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what came next. I finished my coffee, grabbed my jacket, and stepped out into the busy street, feeling the cool breeze on my face. I didn't know where this new chapter would lead me, but that was the beauty of it. I was the author now, writing my own story, and that was all that mattered.